Guys, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully, everyone should have this little colorful piece of paper right here with all these fascinating charts. You guys come on in. There's room over here, and there's a totally empty table over there. Michael's over there. All right, so everyone should have this piece of paper. I realize that the print on it is very small, difficult to see, but I wanted you to have everything fit on one page so that you could sort of compare and contrast them, because they're going to be on separate slides on here, so you can't see them next to each other up here. And there's room over on the side on each view to sort of write down a few notes. Obviously, you're going to have to write down everything that is in the presentation or everything that I say, but you can write down the things that seem really relevant to you. So next week, we plan on jumping into Revelation chapter 20, which is the chapter that repeatedly talks about this period of 1,000 years. And before we really wade too deeply into that, I thought it would be really helpful to give you a summary of the different perspectives, the different views of Revelation chapter 20. It really is a person's understanding and interpretation of Revelation chapter 20 that categorizes people in these different groups according to what they believe about end times. And so this is where we get all the isms, and so we're going to have to talk about all the isms tonight. But before we do that, I'm going to read through Revelation 20, and I just want you to take note of how often the 1,000 years are mentioned, and you'll be able to see that it breaks apart into really three different sections pretty well. We have the first section that goes through verse 6, and then verses 7 through 10, and then 11 down through verse 15. So let's read it, and then we'll talk about the different approaches to it. John says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Oh, did I skip verse 5? Sorry. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So several times we have the 1,000 years mentioned, or the millennium mentioned. And the way that I want us to cover these different views of the millennium, there are 4 of them. And of course, each view has some variations within it. Okay, I'm painting with a broad brush tonight. There are variations within them. Sometimes we'll talk about some of those variations. But I'm going to cover them in sort of a chronological order. Here's what I mean by that. At different times throughout church history, different views have been the dominant view among Christians. And so I want to cover these in the order in which these views were dominant in the history of the church. And when you look in the early church, the earliest writings that we have outside the New Testament, so we'd say the 100s, 200s, even on into the 300s, the view that was the most common, at least that we have the most evidence for, is this first view, which is called premillennialism. Now, in a minute, we'll note that there are a couple of there's another form of premillennialism, and it'll be the 4th view that we talk about. But premillennialism says Christ will return before the millennium. So it's not difficult to figure out what's going on here. Premillennialism, Christ returns before the 1,000 years. And again, there's 2 types. The second type is going to be our 4th view. And postmillennialism is easy to compare with premillennialism because it teaches that Christ will return after the millennium, which is a future golden age for the church on earth. And then lastly, amillennialism. The millennium in this view is a figurative description of the church age. So it's not a future 1,000 years, period of time in the future like with these 2 views. In this view, the millennium is now. And it teaches, like postmillennialism, it teaches that Christ will return after that, obviously. All right, so we'll break these down in that historical order. So in the early church, again, I said they were premillennialists, but they were what we would call historic premillennialists. Historic premillennialists. So many early church theologians held that Christ will return before the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 takes place. And in this particular view, the millennium will be an age of peace and prosperity on the earth, during which Christ and his new covenant people rule over the world. Now, our chart that we're going to build here, which is all on your paper, is what we'll walk through. As we look at these charts, there's some things that we need to notice, all right? And there are some aspects of Revelation 20 that we want to see how they answer them. So, for instance, what does it mean for the devil to be bound by chains and for him to be locked away? What does that mean exactly? Or when he mentions the first resurrection and the second death, what does he mean by that? Those are key terms that are debated and thrown about. What do those things mean? So, in historic premillennialism, we'll start always with the Old Covenant, just so we can contrast things. You start here, Old Testament, and that takes us into the church age, which is inaugurated by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the coming of the Holy Spirit after that. You have the church age. And in historic premillennialism, the church is the new Israel, or the true Israel. At the end of the church age, you will have the resurrection of believers, and that's what they take the first resurrection to be a reference to. You have the resurrection of believers at the same time as the return of Christ. So that kind of all happens at one time at the end of the church age. And then we will have the millennial kingdom. And most historic premillennialists take this to be a literal 1,000 years, though some do not. Some just take 1,000 to be symbolic for a long period of time. During this period of time, Satan will be bound. He will be unable to influence the world. And then, of course, at the end, as we read in Revelation, he is released. And that brings the final judgment, along with the general resurrection. Resurrection of anybody who's alive at that time. Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter, okay? And, and then we'll have, lastly, we'll enter into eternity after the final judgment. This little thing is supposed to be like the judgment throne. You're curious what that is? That's not very good artwork, but whatever. Okay? So, historic premillennialism, yes.
I know that Roman Catholics are amillennials.
Most of them, yes.
Didn't they go before? Weren't they the first?
No. The vast majority of the early church fathers were historic premillennialists. And I'll give you some names in a little bit. All right, so this is our chart. This is how everything works out. It's not overly complicated. Some well-known advocates of historic premillennialism. You have in the early church, I've given you 4 early church fathers because I said it was really dominant in the early church. Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Papias, and Tertullian. If you've never heard of them, that's fine. Okay, don't worry about it. So we move through history a little bit. You have a Reformed Baptist theologian, John Gill. Many of you have probably heard of Charles Spurgeon. George Eldon Ladd is a 20th century name. And then just maybe a few guys that you've heard of. John Piper. You may have heard of Wayne Grudem. He's not a pastor, he's a theologian. But his books are fairly popular. And then Albert Mohler, who's the president of Southern Seminary. Try to throw people in here that you might recognize. Maybe, maybe not. Okay? So there are a lot of well-known advocates for historic premillennialism. Some recommended reading if you want to learn more about it. I'll give you 2 or 3 books for each view. Okay? A Case for Historic Premillennialism. And then there's a book called The Blessed Hope by George Eldon Ladd. He's written other books on end times. That's a shorter one that's a little bit easier to read. But he's written some big, fat, long ones too. George Eldon Ladd. Ladd, L-A-D-D. So this was dominant, say, in the first 200 years or so, maybe even 300 years after the New Testament was written. So you're looking at these early centuries of the church. It's not that there weren't other views. This was just dominant during that period of time. In fact, the other view that we know for sure existed during that time is the next one that we're going to look at. Okay, and that one's amillennialism. There were amillennialists in those early centuries of the church. We know about them because those premillennialists mentioned them. But we don't necessarily have very many of their writings because it wasn't the dominant view. Amillennialism, okay? It was really popularized in the 4th century, so think 300s, by Augustine. He really fully developed it. There were earlier writers we know about that mention it, but he developed it as kind of a system. And then it became the dominant view throughout the next 1,000 years, really, more than 1,000, all the way up through the Reformation. And it's still the dominant view among Roman Catholics today. So in this view, the 1,000 years are figurative. So it's not a literal 1,000 years. It's just saying the 1,000 is a figurative number for a long period of time. And the millennium is the church age. So all millennialists would say we're in the church, we're in the millennium right now. So in this view, we're in the millennium, and really, if you wanted to get technical, you might call this view nunc millennialism. Nunc is the Latin word for now. Whereas means not or no millennium. Well, nobody is saying there's no millennium because it's there in Revelation 20, right? But nunc millennialism sounds funny and it's never going to catch on, so we're stuck with millennialism. But it views the millennium as taking place right now in the present, throughout the church age. And now we'll build our little chart so we can contrast it with the one that we've already seen. Okay? So again, we're going to start with the Old Testament or Old Covenant, leading to the church age, which equals the millennium. So we have the mixture there of colors. It is the millennium. Just like historic premillennialism, in amillennialism, the church is the new Israel. Okay? So they're agreed on that. During the church age, Satan is in some sense bound. Now, obviously, if you're an amillennialist claiming that Satan is bound now, you're not going to interpret the words about him being bound in an overly literal fashion, right? Because we do know he currently prowls around like a roaring lion seeking people to devour. So the amillennialists will say, well, he's bound so that he can't deceive the nations any longer. And the church age right now is the period of time when the gospel is spreading to the ends of the earth. So that under the old covenant, the nations were in darkness, and they were deceived utterly and completely by Satan. But now under the new covenant, during the church age, Satan is not allowed to keep all the nations in that same darkness, that the gospel will go to all the nations, and people from among all the nations will be saved. So they're not interpreting this bound language in as literal a fashion as the premillennialists are. But they still understand, and as you read through Revelation 20, that at the end of the millennium, so at the end of the church age, his shackles will be taken off. In all of these views, you have some sort of great rebellion and great apostasy falling away. In all of them, you have something like that before Christ's return. And it's here it's tied to the release of Satan. In this view, the first resurrection is not a literal physical resurrection, it is the new birth. So that when John talks about blessed are those who share in the first resurrection, he's not talking about people who've been literally physically raised, the amillennialists would say, but he's using language like Paul, where Paul talks about Christians having been raised up and seated with Christ in the heavenly places. So here the first resurrection is not a literal physical resurrection, but a spiritual resurrection. It's the same as the new birth. Now, at the end of the millennium or church age, you will have the general resurrection, the return of Christ. All of that happens together. Followed, of course, by the final judgment, and then eternity. So, on this view is really in terms of charting it out, it's pretty simple. There's not, all of this is happening all at once at the end, right? Fairly simple. So some prominent, well-known advocates. There were some in the early church. A guy named Dionysius, another one, Origen. Those are early church writers. But then Augustine, like I said, is the one who popularizes this view. This view was held by the Reformers. Luther and Calvin and the other Protestant Reformers were all amillennialists. As you move into closer to modern day, A.W. Pink, he started out as a dispensationalist, which we'll talk about in a little bit, a kind of premillennialist. But his later writings, he became a pretty outspoken proponent of amillennialism. Some other guys you might have heard of, J.I. Packer. We've been doing his book, Knowing God, in our community groups. John Murray, I don't know if you've heard of him or not. He's a New Testament scholar in the 20th century. Greg Beale is a current New Testament scholar who's written a lot on end times and has a big, huge commentary on Revelation. Sam Storms, I'll recommend one of his books in a little bit. He's retired now, but a pastor, current day. So some recommended reading if you want to read books by amillennialists arguing for it. A Case for Amillennialism by a guy named Kim Riddlebarger. He also has a blog. If you look him up, and he has articles on a lot of things, but he writes a lot about end times. You read some of his stuff there. Kingdom Come by Sam Storms. I mentioned him already. And then The Bible in the Future by a guy named Anthony Hoekema. This book's a little bit older now, but still good. Anthony Hoekema, Hoekema. And that should say, that should say amillennialism. Typo. All right, so third view. I know I'm running through these quickly. I'm trying to give us time for you to ask questions. Postmillennialism. So moving ahead, premillennialism, historic premillennialism was dominant in the early church. From Augustine all the way through the Protestant Reformation, it's mostly all-millennialism. But when you look at the period after the Reformation, the Puritans, most of the Puritans would have been postmillennialists. And in this view, Christ is going to come, post is important, after the millennium, after the 1,000 years. And so the millennium is, in postmillennialism, it is a golden age of peace and prosperity on the earth, brought about by the spread of the gospel and the influence of the church in the world. So like premillennialists, postmillennialists believe that the 1,000 years are still in the future. All millennialists, it's now. Premillennialists and postmillennialists, it's in the future. Maybe our chart will help us. Again, Old Testament leading in the church age. And what happens is the church age eventually transitions into the millennium. As the gospel spreads, so this is a very optimistic view of where things are headed, okay? That the gospel is going to spread to the ends of the earth. More and more people are going to be converted. And that Christianity, the church in general, will have a profound impact on every society in the world, and it will lead to this golden age. So, just like the other two views, in this view, the church is the new Israel. Satan is bound, although in a less literal sense than you have under premillennialism. He's bound and then, of course, released at the end of the millennium. And then you have general resurrection, return of Christ, followed immediately by the final judgment, and then the new heavens and new earth. So the difference between this and the other two views, in premillennialism, you had a break right here between the church age and the millennium, and you would move these things here. In amillennialism, it looks very similar. The difference is you don't gradually lead into this millennium. The whole thing is both church age and millennium. Some well-known advocates. That's misspelled. John Owen. Jonathan Edwards. I could have put almost any Puritan on there, though. I didn't put any. I should have. Unless you count John Owen as a Puritan. Charles Hodge, B.B. Warfield, a little bit more moving forward, R.C. Sproul. You may not have heard of these other guys. Kenneth Gentry, he's a scholar. He's a Baptist scholar. Douglas Wilson, you might have heard of him. James White, a popular guy online. Jeff Durbin. Just different guys. And if you want to read on it, postmillennialism, an eschatology of hope. Again, I said it's very optimistic, right? And that's by a guy named Keith Matheson. And then there's a book, Postmillennialism Made Easy, by Kenneth Gentry, who I mentioned a minute ago. All right, last one. In the mid to late 1800s, premillennialism made a comeback. So many people are postmillennial up until the mid 1800s. So from say the mid 1600s, early to mid 1600s, 1700s, and much of the 1800s, most Protestants were postmillennial. And that makes sense because that was a period of the spread of the gospel to parts of the world where it had never gone. They brought the gospel to America. Many Native Americans were converted. They went to Africa and Asia. Christian missionaries were going all over the world. Prior to that, Christianity was largely a European and Northern African thing. But after the Reformation, the modern missionary movement began, and you have Christianity going all over the place. And so it's a time of great expectation and hope that, the gospel is spreading and it's going to transform the world. And so the Puritans came to America fully believing that they were participating in God's plan to bring in the millennium by preaching the gospel to people who had never heard it. Well, that optimism begins to wane eventually, and premillennialism reemerges, but a different kind of premillennialism. It's different. So that in the early to mid-1800s, there was a new form. Like all forms of premillennialism, this view that we're going to look at holds that Christ will return before the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. That's why it's premillennial. However, the purpose of the millennium is different in this view. The millennium is not a period of time where Christ and his new covenant people rule over the earth. Instead, the millennium is a period of time in which God's promises to ethnic or national Israel are literally fulfilled. That's the purpose of the millennium in this view. Is that all the promises made under the Old Covenant or to Old Testament Israel would be literally fulfilled during this 1,000 years. So in this view, the church is not in any sense a new Israel. So this is where it's very different from all the other views. In all the other views, the promises made to Israel are fulfilled either in Christ or the church. In this view, no. God is going to literally fulfill those promises in the millennium with ethnic Israel, so that the church in this view, in dispensationalism, is like a parenthesis. It's like a pause button in God's dealings with Israel. But he's going to resume his dealings with Israel in the millennium in dispensationalism. The chart might help us a little bit with that, okay? And this one's going to look a little bit different. So you have the Old Covenant, and then I'm going to put the church age on here in a minute, but what happens is there's a break here. So no arrow kind of leading into where the promises lead into the church age. No, the church age is different. So here, there's a break, and it's only when you get to the millennium that the promises of the Old Testament are fulfilled for a national ethnic Israel. So the church comes in between God's dealings with Israel. So that's why it's often called a parenthesis. It's a break. And then famously, in dispensationalism, at the end of the church age, you have the resurrection of living believers, okay, called the rapture. This is where we get the rapture language from. If you've been wondering where it is, here we are. They go to meet the Lord in the air. He comes down sort of part way, meets them in the air. And then comes this period of tribulation. A 7-year period of tribulation. Remember, all the views have bad things happening at the end of the church age or before the final judgment. All of them have a rebellion and terrible things happening. But what's unique to dispensationalism, besides the idea that the millennium is the time when the promises are fulfilled to Israel, is this 7-year tribulation that we're probably most of us very familiar with. Now, there are some, of course, who hold to what's called a mid-tribulational position. So I put that arrow on there, but it's kind of faded. They're still in this category, but they hold that the rapture or that first resurrection is going to happen in the middle of the tribulation. Well, a lot of it comes from the language in Revelation where where you have 3.5 years and 3.5 years, and so why is it broken up like that? And they're speculating on that. There are other reasons, but that's where a lot of it comes from. And then after the tribulation, you have the return of Christ, which brings in the millennium, again, where God is fulfilling his promises to Old Testament Israel. During that period of time, Satan is bound. He can't do anything in the world. At the end, he's released. And you have Armageddon, leading to a general resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment, and then eternity. So when we think about some of the issues, we think about the nature of the millennium. In this view, of course, the purpose of the millennium is so God can fulfill his promises to ethnic Israel. In postmillennialism, the purpose of the millennium is the result of the gospel essentially transforming the world. In amillennialism, it is the church age. And in historic premillennialism, it is a future age in which Christ rules on the earth, but it's not for the purpose of fulfilling the promises to ethnic Israel. It's not for that purpose. So the millennium itself, the 1,000 years itself, serves a different purpose or is defined in a different way in each view. When you talk about the first resurrection, in dispensationalism, it's the rapture. In amillennialism, it's the new birth. In the other two views, it's generally speaking just a resurrection, to be followed by another resurrection later, a physical resurrection. The biggest difference the biggest thing that I think to account for is that in the first three views that we looked at, all of those have the church as a kind of new Israel or true Israel, and understand the promises made in the Old Testament to be fulfilled in a spiritual way, either in Christ himself or in the church. So those three are united in that. They may disagree about the nature of the millennium, but they all hold that in common. Whereas this final view, which was dominant in the 20th century, okay? It arises or becomes popular in the late 1800s, but really spreads in the 20th century. Postmillennialism is really optimistic. The gospel is going to spread, the world's going to get better and better. Dispensationalism is probably the most pessimistic of the views, because dispensationalism sees everything moving toward this period of tribulation. It makes sense that the 20th century would tilt things toward dispensationalism. If the modern missionary movement and the spread of the gospel following the Reformation made everybody really positive and led them to be postmillennial, many people, then it makes sense that the 20th century, in which you had 2 world wars and a lot of other major world conflicts, where it became clear that while the gospel had spread to a lot of places, we were nowhere near a golden age. It makes sense that dispensationalism would catch on. And then, of course, with the establishment of the state of Israel following World War II, which was in part, it's a little bit of self-fulfillment of prophecy, because you have people who believe in that future Israel who are pushing for it to a certain extent, along with a large number of Jewish Zionists at the time really pushing for it. But nevertheless, the appearance of a nation called Israel really tilts things toward dispensationalism for a lot of people. So early church, premillennialism, historic premillennialism. Then you get amillennialism for a large chunk of church history. And then after the Reformation, postmillennialism, everybody's positive and optimistic. And then in the 20th century, dispensationalism, things don't look quite as great. And so now if you say, okay, but we're in the 21st century, what's going on now? Well, we have a real mix of things. And to some degree, you can break it down generationally, I think, at least among evangelicals in America, so that you're more likely to find more dispensationalists among the older generations. It's what they were taught throughout the 20th century. And among, say, Gen X, my generation, you'll find still quite a few dispensationalists, but you're going to find a lot more amillennialists and historical premillennialists. I think among millennials, you're seeing a turn and a push toward postmillennialism. And then Gen Z doesn't have a clue. They don't even know what these are. So, but sometimes you can kind of break it down generationally, although, again, that's a broad brush, right? Right now, today, we have a true kind of mixture where you have still a lot of dispensationalists, but you have a lot of people who are embracing those other views. A whole lot of people. And so you're going to find all of these views in the church today. So just to give you some well-known advocates of this last view, because I forgot to. Early on, and really the architect of dispensationalism is John Nelson Darby, although he didn't popularize it as much as C.I. Scofield did with his Scofield Study Bible. It was the very first study Bible ever published, and it was thoroughly dispensational in its notes. Lewis Sperry Chafer, Charles Ryrie, theologians, dispensational theologians in the 20th century. Popular preachers and writers that you've probably heard of, John MacArthur, Charles Stanley, Chuck Swindoll, David Jeremiah, Tim LaHaye. You'll note that all of these last ones are really all of the same generation, right? And some of them were very popular on TV all the time, on the radio all the time. So it makes it really, you can see, oh yeah, that really was dominant in the 20th century among evangelicals. That was what everyone was hearing. If you want to learn more from dispensationalists on dispensationalism, of course you can just get Dispensationalism by Charles Ryrie. There's a book called The Millennial Kingdom by John Walvoord. And then another book, Things to Come by J. Dwight Pentecost. All of these are setting forth and defending the dispensational view. All right. So now that I've thoroughly confused you all, I'm going to give the floor to you guys to ask questions about any of these different views. Yes.
A couple, but one of them, so for amillennialism, you were saying that is the only one that kind of has Satan bound during the church age.
Yes.
And I guess my question is, but people were saved in the Old Covenant.
Yes.
So if how does that make, if Satan was fully active to blind everyone, then how was anyone saved? So
Yeah, so but it's largely Israelites that are saved. There are a few Gentiles here and there, like Ruth, right? There are a few, but not many. Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. So Lisa was just pointing out that, well, looking at the all-millennial view where Satan was bound during the church age so the gospel could spread to the nations, there are Gentiles under the old covenant who were saved, and that's true. It's not that no one could be saved outside of Israel during the old covenant. There were individuals who were. But by and large, God's revelation was limited to the descendants of Abraham. So the perspective under the old covenant is that the nations are in darkness and light only comes from Israel. That's the kind of the Old Testament perspective. And the all-millennialists would say that's true. And when Christ, the true Israel, came into the world, that light really shone and went to the nations. As predicted, right, in Isaiah, that he would be a light to the nations. So that would be how I think the answer would be given. So just like him being bound now doesn't mean he's not active in the world. You can't read that overly literally in the all-millennial view. It's just he's bound with respect to that ability to keep the nations in darkness the way he did prior to Christ's coming. Jessica?
Have you discovered or discussed rapture in like other chapters or going over that? Because I don't understand. According to this, I also saw the souls that who had been beheaded
Right.
the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received the mark on their foreheads or on their heads. That happens during the tribulation. So if we're raptured out of here, how are there people beheaded?
Well, yeah, so only dispensationalism even believes in a 7-year tribulation. None of these other views even have that. Because you won't find that clearly spelled out in the New Testament. You've got to go to Daniel, and it's a very complicated passage in Daniel to get that. So all these other views aren't even looking for a 7-year tribulation. In dispensationalism, under the tribulation, there are Christians, there are people who are saved after the rapture. And I think that's probably what they would argue, that there are people saved after the rapture who are Christians, and they're the ones that are martyred during the tribulation. I think that would be their answer. So the 7-year tribulation is unique to the last view. It's not found in the other views. Not a 7-year tribulation. Tribulation in general is in the Bible, yes. And Jesus talks about great tribulation. That's all Daniel.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay.
That's all Daniel, and dispensationalists are the only people in church history to have interpreted it that way, where you end up with a 7-year tribulation in the future. That's not an interpretation that you find anywhere else. So that doesn't automatically mean that it's wrong, but it kind of gives us pause. And that was why I didn't put any kind of tribulation on the other charts, to point out that that's unique to that view, that 7-year tribulation. All the views hold that tribulation exists. People suffer. Tribulation is just suffering. Right? Throughout Revelation? The 3.5, well, it's not all over the Bible. It's only in Daniel and in Revelation. And those are both apocalyptic. And so numbers in this is what I would say. Numbers in apocalyptic literature are always symbolic. They're not literal. And that the 42 months, which is another way of saying 7 years, or the 7, or whatever, all of those are ways of talking about the church age. That they're not to be taken literally as signifying a literal period of 7 years or 3.5 years. That none of that's literal. Yeah. Lisa.
So when we're talking about tribulation, as that is, are we talking, let me two more questions. Are we talking about the bowls and the judgments, like Revelation, everything we've just gone through? That, I believe, what they're talking about, that's when that is going to happen. Those all the bowls, all the seals.
In dispensationalism, yes. But not in any of the other views. Those are things that happen. Now, generally speaking, among the trumpets, seals, bowls, the seventh and sometimes the sixth one, those are things happening right at the end before Christ's return. But the others are describing things that happen throughout church history. Now, that's how amillennialists and most historic premillennialists would understand it. Postmillennialists get divided into two camps. You have some who would say virtually all of Revelation until you get to chapter 20, or some say chapter 19, is describing events in the first century, before the fall of Jerusalem. And it's not about end times at all. Only the end of Revelation is about end times. Those are called preterists. And so they would relate most of the book of Revelation to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The other brand of postmillennialists don't do that, but their interpretation of the book of Revelation is going to be much more, it's very similar to all millennialists in understanding most of the language symbolically. They would come to, like, for instance, Revelation 19, Jesus is conquering, and they would say, well, he's conquering by the sword that comes out of his mouth, and so that's not his return. That's him conquering the nations with the gospel, leading into the millennium. So they're not interpreting things literally. Yes, he does. Yeah. Well, but it's not 7 years. Daniel, the 7 years in Daniel are not you have to interpret. You have to interpret the 70 weeks in a very specific way, where the last week refers to refers to the Great Tribulation. But nowhere does it say that last week, those last 7 years of Daniel 9, are the Great Tribulation. When Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation there in Matthew, he's probably talking about the fall of Jerusalem. That's probably, my interpretation of Matthew 24 and 25, part of it relates to the fall of Jerusalem, and part of it relates to the second coming. Because the disciples asked two questions. When Jesus says, not a stone will be left on this great, grand, beautiful building, the temple that you see, his disciples then ask, when are these things going to take place, and what will be the sign of your coming? And Jesus splits those apart, I think. First, I'll tell you about the destruction of this temple in this city, and there's going to be great tribulation. Then I'll tell you about my return. So I think he's answering two questions there that they think are tied together, but are not. So I don't think the Great Tribulation there refers to an event at the end of history, but instead refers to the fall of Jerusalem. But again, nowhere are we directly told that there is a 7-year tribulation called the Great Tribulation that happens close to Christ's return, around Christ's return. We're never told that specifically. It's an interpretation of Daniel chapter 9, a specific interpretation that is really the foundation of dispensationalism in terms of their chronology and the way that they work it out. That's where all of that comes from, is from their specific interpretation of the 70 weeks of Daniel. Yeah.
Even in the very scriptures that you're quoting in Matthew 24, 29, it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, which are described as the tribulation, like the bowls and stuff happening. And then it says, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and victory. So I don't know, like that just sounds to me like tribulation, Jesus.
You're right.
I don't,
Yeah, and a lot of people interpret it that way. My understanding of the text there is that there is a natural break there in the text between, and now some would argue that the signs in the sky are a way of describing the travail and the terrible things that happen around the fall of Jerusalem. So for instance, we did this early in our study of Revelation. When we were looking at, for instance, when David describes a particular military victory, we read about that military victory in one chapter. David writes a poem about it in the next. It's a pretty routine military victory on the field of battle. But as David writes about it, he writes about it in this apocalyptic terminology of the mountains trembling and all these things happening. And so what a lot of scholars would say is this is language that's pretty typical, and we do find it in a lot of other Jewish writings, a pretty typical way of dramatically describing historical events, right? That the sky is turning colors, the stars are falling, all of these things. But they are ways of describing, of kind of heightening the tension and giving a graphic description of events that are far more ordinary in the actual way that they play out, right? And that's where, we see that in the Old Testament, those poetic descriptions of events that we just read the story of, and no mountains crumbled. And yet they're saying the mountains are crumbling and things like that. So that a lot of scholars would look at that language and say, well, that's a way of describing and describing the destruction of Jerusalem as a kind of cataclysmic event in the life of the nation of Israel. And a lot of them would take it that way. Others would break it in different places. Depends on where you break it, right? But the key point there is to note that nowhere in Matthew 24 or 25 is the tribulation that Jesus mentioned, is it described as a 7-year tribulation. Right? That's what I'm saying. The idea of a 7-year tribulation is unique to dispensationalism. It's derived not from anywhere in the New Testament, but from the book of Daniel.
But Jesus is referencing the book of Daniel for the 7-year tribulation. That's why I'm getting hung up on.
What now? Say that again.
This is referencing Daniel and the 7-year tribulation in the Olivet Discourse. So how does that not be literal?
But Daniel doesn't say, so the 7-year tribulation that we're talking about, all of that language that's not what Daniel on the surface level says. That requires a lot of interpretive work to get there. Daniel talks about tribulation, okay? He talks about great tribulation even. But it's a particular interpretation that assigns that to a 7-year period, okay, either before, after, or right around the time of Christ's return. That's an interpretation of Daniel. It's not just the surface level reading of the text. And what I'm saying is, it's an interpretation unique to dispensationalism. No one else in the history of the church has ever read it that way.
I just read my Bible. You know what I mean? Like, so I
But-
just read my Bible, like not studying all these scholars, which is awesome. That's how.
Well, here's what I'm saying though. None of us actually just read our Bibles. We read them through a lens. We don't know the lens is there most of the time. So the only thing you and I learned growing up was dispensationalism. I didn't know it was called that. I just thought that's what the Bible said about end times, right? So those were the only lenses I had to read the Bible. But Christians for hundreds of years read the same Bible, but because they didn't have those lenses, they didn't see it there, right? So none of us comes as a blank slate when we read the Bible. We all come reading it through a particular set of lenses. And most of us, if we were raised in church, initially come to all these different end times passages with dispensational lenses, right? That's just how we see it. But when we really start to ask really hard questions of the text, sometimes we'll notice, oh, I guess it doesn't say that. That's what I thought it was saying, right? And so for me, and I'm going to have to finish up because we're going to cover Revelation 20 next week, but for me, really, the thing that led me away from dispensationalism, which is what I was taught growing up, was if we go back to our chart, in dispensationalism, this is the big deal, okay? That the whole point of all of this is that these promises made to Israel have to be literally fulfilled. That's the bedrock of dispensationalism. All the Old Testament promises must be literally fulfilled. And so that's the time of the millennium. I mean, that's the whole point of dispensationalism, is to find a time when those promises can be literally fulfilled. What led me away from dispensationalism was not studying end times at all. I wasn't even thinking about things like the rapture or the tribulation. I wasn't thinking about any of that. What I was doing was studying and trying to learn, how do the New Testament writers interpret the Old Testament? Because I wanted to know how to read the Bible better, and I thought, who better than an inspired interpreter of the Bible to teach me how to interpret the Bible? What I discovered inadvertently, what I wasn't looking to discover, was that the New Testament writers don't interpret the Old Testament the way that this scheme does. They're not looking for literal fulfillments of all of those promises. They keep seeing these promises fulfilled in a non-literal way in Christ and in the church. And they present both Jesus and the church as a kind of new Israel. Right? So Jesus is the true vine, whereas in the Old Testament, that's Israel. Okay? In Galatians, everyone who puts their faith in Christ is a son of Abraham, but that's Israel in the Old Testament. So that the New Testament writers don't embrace this idea that those promises need to be literally fulfilled. And that's none of this business about, I came to kind of look at different views of the rapture and tribulation later on, right? But that was the thing that said to me, I think something is suspect in this whole approach, where I'm looking for something to happen with Israel in the future so that all these promises can be fulfilled, so they can occupy the exact borders that were promised to them, so that Jesus can literally reign in Jerusalem on David's throne. That didn't seem to be what the New Testament writers were doing. And so that's what led me away from dispensationalism as a whole, was that overly literal approach that they take to interpreting the Old Testament. And I would say that's also true in the ways in which they interpret those passages in Daniel. It really is their understanding of the passages in Daniel that lead to this chart right here. Because in Daniel, they see a period of time. You have, let me get my numbers right, 62, 6, and 1, right? At the end. And so you need a time period in which you can have the church here, but God's not dealing with Israel. And then you need to do something with that dangling last 70th week out there, right? And so here it is, the tribulation. But Daniel is not as clear as that. In fact, Daniel 9 is one of the most difficult chapters in the Bible to interpret. For anybody. For anybody. Doesn't matter what view you hold to. It's complicated. So, what I would say is become familiar with these different views, okay? When you're reading somebody and they're writing about end times, try to classify them. Figure out what lenses they're wearing, because everybody's wearing them. It doesn't mean that your lenses are wrong. They might be right, okay? But just figure out what other people are wearing and understand why they're saying some of the things that they're saying. Judy?
Also, there's not a 7-year separation between the rapture of the church and the judgment of the others.
Right.
They're simultaneous judgment, and that's another reason.
Well, yeah, one of the difficulties of dispensationalism is this separation between what they call the rapture, which is just the resurrection of believers, and the return of Christ. That you've got a separation here. And we don't see that. The New Testament, like for instance, when Paul talks about the return of Christ, he doesn't have that separation. It all happens at once. And so that is a complication here. Susan?
So, like, I have never seen this before of saying that the millennial kingdom where God fulfills the promises of Jerusalem. I understand what you're saying, but I feel like God deals with Jerusalem in that tribulation area. And from my roots, just saying that once the Christians are taken up, then God is dealing with his.
He is, but it's a time of great travail and sort of movement toward that, right? It's this time of just the Christians removed from the world, really bad stuff happening, and Christ's return puts an end to all of that and ushers in all these promises. Yeah. Well, for Israel. Oh, that's the whole point of it. You don't have dispensationalism without that. The whole purpose of dispensationalism is to find a place somewhere in the Bible's timeline where these promises can be literally fulfilled. That's the whole point of it. Take that away and there's no reason for the rest of it. Right? There's no reason for it. Yeah, so we got to go. It's 7:46. Anybody's got to get kids, go. I'll keep answering questions, but some of you got to get kids.
Is there no new heaven, no earth in dispensationalism?
Oh, I just left that off, yeah. It's the same thing. Yeah. No, I just left that little copy and paste off.